Your Honor, I'll make it short.
Wrestlers Court. You may have heard those words before, but have you ever wondered exactly what they're all about? Especially if you're a newer fan, what is this thing? It was a loose concept that ruled over the WWE locker room and locker room of many other wrestling promotions for a good part of wrestling's past. It lends itself to the machismo-driven, on-the-road lifestyle of pro wrestlers, and it isn't exactly a tradition that we can recall being held up recently. It perfectly sums up, though, the lifestyle of wrestlers during the 1990s and into the 2000s. So what exactly is the Wrestlers Court?
Stand back. There's a new wrestling quiz coming through. Check out BrainBuster, the daily quiz that tests your WWE knowledge with winning streaks, stats, and more. It's time to see if you're up for the challenge.
In short, it was an unofficial legal system within the ranks of wrestlers where a few judges or locker room leaders and veterans were notified about issues pertaining to other superstars. Basically, it was a way for wrestlers to police themselves. Yeah, it's gonna get weird. We'll get into it. This is Sportskeeda Wrestling. I'm Kevin. Would you want to see the Wrestlers Court become its own TV show streaming for WWE? Let us know. Watch this whole video and get in the comments and let us know what you think. If there was ever any kind of issue backstage, rather than management having to deal with it, a select few superstars, exclusively veterans, could play the role of judge, jury, and executioner, while the other side would have a defendant who most likely would declare some level of guilt. It was a system put in place that was essentially created to put any issues to rest, especially pertaining to superstars who had a lot of heat backstage for different reasons. Also, there was just things that came up on the road, and this was a way for the wrestlers to entertain themselves between the shows. You may have heard the one about the Undertaker, the locker room leader and the man who essentially ruled over Wrestlers Court for a majority of his in-ring career. But if the Undertaker wasn't present, various other veterans would take their place in these stories that have been handed out, JBL or Triple H. On the defensive side, you could have another veteran representing or acting as a character witness. What many people don't know is that The Undertaker was actually the first person to be put on trial in Wrestlers Court. If you're looking up wrestling court stories already and not paying attention to this video thinking they're only from WWE, they actually have their roots back in the territorial wrestling days, outside of the WWE with the likes of Dirty Dutch Mantell. Yeah, you can check them out on our other Sportskeeda Wrestling channel, Wrestle Binge, with Smack Talk every week after SmackDown. Mantell, ever the ring veteran who'd been around the world many times over in the wrestling circuits, decided there needed to be a system in every locker room to handle the heat independently of management before it reached a boiling point and became a bigger issue. When it actually started off, the idea was fairly lighthearted. It was humorous. Mantell took The Undertaker, a young Undertaker, to court over him denying allegations of a backstage romance with a few of the girls, or as the way Mantell put it on his wrestling shoot interview on YouTube, romancing the rats. We're quoting him there, don't get mad at me. But The Undertaker loved the concept so much that he brought it over to WWE when he joined the big time promotion, perhaps when he had a little bit more pull backstage and became a judge in most cases that presided over these disagreements. But even Mantell was surprised at how much the Wrestlers Court took a life of its own in WWE. It began to be used in more serious matters, not just the lighthearted stuff. But the punishments are what really stood out. We didn't even mention that the punishment side of things was, varied. The punishments for wrestlers who were almost always found guilty would range from paying a bar tab worth thousands of dollars or paying the expenses on the road, and in some cases, outright paying for another wrestler's hotel room for a few days. You might be thinking, wait, but doesn't that put veteran wrestlers in a position of power to simply exploit less experienced superstars and get what they wanted out of them? It could be argued, yeah, and it could happen to be more than one occasion of that happening, but most wrestlers, including The Undertaker, simply label it as a bit of fun. Not everyone agrees with that sentiment, but we'll get to that later. Now that you kind of know how the Wrestlers Court operates, who presided over it, and what punishments were handed out, it's time to get into some of the stories and victims of Wrestlers Court. Many significant names in WWE have had to undergo trial in Wrestlers Court, including Edge and Christian, the Hardy Boys, Mick Foley, Goldberg, The Miz, Molina, Muhammad Hassan, JTG, Teddy Long, Bob Holly, and more. Let's get into some of the stories that really give you some context as to what kind of justice, or some version of that, qualifies backstage in WWE. Back when Edge and Christian were still young upstarts in the ranks of WWE trying to make a name for themselves, they were working directly with Brian Gewirtz, an acclaimed writer in WWE. They decided to get a little bit friendly with Brian, and it was more friendly than maybe the locker room was going to accept. How did they do this, you ask? Well, let's explain. They gifted him science fiction action figures that he was collecting, and after rumors emerged that Edge and Christian had dinner with Gewirtz's parents, they were promptly taken to court. The accusation was that they were trying to butter up a writer to get a better spot on TV. To their credit, both Edge and Christian handled it extremely well. According to one of their big on-screen rivals, Bully Ray, aka Bubba Ray Dudley, they brought into court a book with a cover saying how to kiss ass, politic, and influence people. Not only did they admit to buttering up Gewirtz to get a better spot, but they even brought the Undertaker a bottle of Jack Daniels, which seemed to be more than enough to get the Taker to throw the entire case into the trash. Goldberg had to face some serious humiliation thanks to the Wrestlers Court. Some of you may know the story where Goldberg and Chris Jericho got into a backstage altercation, with all the accounts stating a much smaller Jericho somehow came out victorious. This was allegedly Goldberg who took an issue to the Wrestlers Court, but he was probably stunned when the verdict went against him. The judge presiding over the case was Triple H, who told Goldberg that not only was he in the wrong over their altercation, but he made Goldberg admit to everyone present that Chris Jericho was the better wrestler. Oh, that had to hurt. In what might be the most ridiculous case in Wrestlers Court stories that we could find, we go to SummerSlam 2004. There was a dodgeball match held between the women of WWE and a few hopeful Diva Search contestants. It was the young hopefuls that won the dodgeball match, and this became an issue among the boys, apparently, because it made the roster, quote, look bad, and they took the women of WWE to court. The one who had to defend the women was none other than Ivy herself, who explained to the judge, Triple H, that the match was scripted and meant to put over the younger divas. Although he wasn't buying it, any punishment was thrown out the window when Ivy bribed him with a few gift vouchers for the Red Roof Inn Hotel. You see where we're going here? This is not a politically ethical system. One of the worst cases of Wrestlers Court that has become public is with Molina. Back in the ruthless aggression days, she didn't have the best reputation backstage with some people. She allegedly burned bridges with other women on the roster like Mickie James, Lita, Trish Stratus, Candice Michelle, and others. And although there was never any specific reason mentioned as to why she was called into court, it's believed that it was done to maybe knock her down a few pegs. The entire locker room, that's right, the entire freaking locker room was called into a hotel ballroom to witness the trial of Molina. The Brian Kendrick and Paul London placed a bet on how long it would take for Molina to break down in tears. Ouch. And the answer to that was less than 10 minutes. This is getting rough. She allegedly suffered verbal abuse during that trial in what seems to be one of the worst cases of Wrestlers Court that is out there in public. Another case happened around this time was that of Muhammad Hassan, who already had some pre-existing heat and a visit to the court because he no-sold a move from the legendary Sergeant Slaughter. While this was frowned upon amongst wrestlers, he argued that he was specifically instructed to no-sell the move by someone higher up the ladder, and that got him a pass. But what turned out to be a huge lesson for him was his incident with Eddie Guerrero. For those who were too young to remember, in the ruthless aggression era, Muhammad Hassan used the famous camel clutch hold, as did Eddie Guerrero. Hassan probably forgot to do his research when he confronted Guerrero and asked him why he used the move. For those wondering, the camel clutch maneuver was invented by Eddie's father, Gory Guerrero. That understandably got under Eddie's skin a bit, and it wound up being an issue in Wrestlers Court. The verdict was that he had to pay the locker room's $4,000 bar tab for his violation. Even The Miz's infamous incident where he ate some chicken in the locker room and the crumbs fell on Chris Benoit's gym bag, that was taken to Wrestlers Court. And as you may know, the verdict was that The Miz was not allowed to change in the locker room for months. It's not a far-fetched thing to say that a few crumbs of chicken getting on someone's bag is probably an excessive reason to boot somebody out of a locker room, but maybe there were other issues. Normally, this would have been the death sentence for someone like Miz's career breaking into the WWE ranks, but to date, he remains one of the only men in WWE history not only to survive being kicked out of a locker room, but turned everything around and became a freaking Grand Slam champion who is widely respected. If that doesn't tell you how awesome The Miz is outside of his on-screen character, then nothing really will. There are a few other instances that have become public, a few involving the Hardy Boys sitting in a first-class plane seat reserved for Kane, JTG having some issue, Hardcore Bob Holly getting abandoned at an airport by Mick Foley due to a miscommunication, Victoria reportedly taking a seat that should have been given to a more senior member of the WWE locker room. Yeah, there's a lot of these stories that you can find. This humble voice that you hear right now was actually once witness to a Wrestlers Court in person in a locker room in a world-famous venue that I do not need to reveal with people I do not need to name. Being witness to it involved shutting up and letting the silliness play out. The case involves some younger wrestlers making a car of traveling talent late, reportedly, for the show. And this led, once the other talent heard about this in the locker room, having court called on that green talent for their transgressions. I vaguely recall the case in some way being settled in some form with bribery in the form of not booze, but energy drinks. There seems to be some type of changing sentiment as to the entire culture of Wrestlers Court. It became a topic of discussion a few years ago when CM Punk put out a tweet slamming the entire idea. He described it as, quote, small D energy, and went on to call it, quote, an average white man embarrassment to the wrestling business of all time. This was met with quite a polarizing response. Booker T, a Hall of Famer and a veteran in his own right, responded to it by stating that the wrestling business needs something like Wrestlers Court because of the pecking order, and that undeniably exists within the system of talent. Dutch Mantell, the creator of Wrestling Court, was a little more lighthearted in his response to Punk and said that it's possible that Punk was taken to court a few times and that he didn't have the backstage pull he wanted. But whether you agree with CM Punk or Booker T or other veterans, we can present to you one clear piece of evidence. The Wrestlers Court doesn't exist in today's WWE locker room by all accounts that we're aware of, and it seems to be healthier than it's ever been before. There's been a huge shift in locker room culture within WWE, and Seth Rollins has described Wrestlers Court as antiquated or an old-fashioned thing that's past its purpose, and confirmed that it doesn't happen anymore. You can thank superstars like maybe Rollins for that. There's a new generation of locker room leaders, and you never really hear anything about issues backstage anyway. Or maybe we simply just don't hear about them. This isn't to say that issues don't exist or egos don't clash. They just have maybe a more mature way of dealing with it. You may have the rare situation when Roman Reigns or someone like him is forced to kick Enzo Amore out of a tour bus in Europe, but that seems to be more of an exception than the rule. It's quite polarizing when you look at the stories of Wrestlers Court. On one hand, you have lighthearted situations like the Edge and Christian one, buying a bottle of Jack Daniels for the Undertaker, while there's other incidents with Mick Foley and Al Snow where they have to pay for Bob Holly's expenses on the road for a few days. Then you have situations like The Miz and Molina, where the punishments are, in the eyes of some, maybe humiliating or simply just bullying. Molina once described an incident of Wrestlers Court that wasn't her own, but it involved an unidentified tag team. She mentioned that it took place in the late hours of the night or early morning when people just wanted to sleep, and it involved the judge and the prosecution pitting multiple stars against each other and leading to an actual physical altercation of some kind that ended up with doctors getting involved. However you feel about this system, the results certainly speak for themselves, and they greatly vary. However you feel about this system, the results can speak for themselves in a different way depending on how you look at it. The results make one thing clear overall. The Wrestlers Court, whether it had any actual benefits or not, is absolutely a divisive pastime and a governing tactic within the ranks of wrestling talent of the past. Whether it works in today's wrestling, well, that's just a case to bring up in maybe a different court of judgment. Do you think Wrestlers Court should still be a thing? Let us know in the comments below. Would you want to see it become a TV show of some kind? I'd love to hear your take on that as well. Hit the like button and check out Sportskeeda Wrestling here on YouTube for even more content just like this.
He's done. He's